The Western is, of course, a quintessentially American genre, bound up in that nation's status as the foremost capitalist superpower. How then did it become so popular in communist countries, which were ideologically and very nearly militarily opposed to the United States? Well, to begin with, it's worth pointing out that the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union went through several changes before their Cold War rivalry. In the early years of the USSR, there was a limited amount of cultural dialogue between the two superpowers, which meant that Soviet filmmakers could create their own versions of the Western. The Western was also a popular genre in Eastern Europe, long before it turned communist. There was therefore an existing audience for Westerns, and it made good commercial sense for the film industries of the Eastern Bloc to exploit that fact. Of course, the Eastern Bloc wasn't one big country, it was made up of many different countries, and in many cases, they each upheld radically different versions of communism. This had an effect on the type of red westerns they produced, which can be boiled down into two distinct types. Over yonder in East Germany, for example, the red western looked, in many ways, like a typical Hollywood product. They played at cowboys and Indians, just like John Wayne did. The twist was that the cowboys were the bad guys, and the Indians, well, the Indians were red. By contrast, in that their Soviet Union, red westerns looked different, but told familiar stories. Cowboys were good, Indians were bad, except the cowboys were in the Red Army, and the Indians were either Muslims or anarchists, or both. Between East Germany and the Soviet Union, red westerns were produced by other Eastern Bloc countries, with certain significant differences. I'll talk about these as well, but for now, let's go right back to the start of communist rule in Eastern Europe, when the red western first appeared. In the aftermath of the tumultuous half-decade following the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks looked to the United States for ideas on how to rebuild the shattered Soviet Union. Lenin made speeches about the Philadelphian guru of time and motion, Frederick Taylor, while Stalin invented the phrase American exceptionalism. In this, the Politburo was the vanguard of the proletariat. Russian filmgoers were infatuated with Hollywood, almost to the point of sickness. The director, Lev Kulizov, diagnosed this condition as Americanshina, or Americanitis. How to treat this epidemic? Well, one director, Ivan Perestiani, thought the disease itself might be the cure. In 1923, he adapted a novel called Red Devils, which was inspired by American pulp fiction. That was a type of cheap paperback novel, often with a western setting, and you don't have to be a Tarantino to spot the influence here. Let's compare it with the 1913 D.W. Griffith film, The Battle at Elderbush Gulch. Many of Griffith's films had been distributed in the Soviet Union and were influential on Soviet directors like Sergei Eisenstein. The similarities between these films are therefore easy to spot. The homestead becomes an industrial new town, the frontier the Ukrainian periphery, and the Indians Makhnovist thugs. That synthesis of American form and Soviet content proved enormously successful. Red Devils was the first homegrown film to match American titles at the box office. But for Kulizov, doctor of Americanitis, Red Devils was a placebo, nothing more. He came up with his own miracle cure, which had the snappy title, The Extraordinary Adventures of Mr. West in the Land of the Bolsheviks. Kulizov incarnated his fascination with the genre in the character of Jedi, a cowboy set loose on the streets of Moscow. This vehicular chase was an obvious homage to Hollywood spectacle, but it's also something else. It's a clash between the fantasy of American machismo and the reality of Soviet city planning. Rugged individualism versus the centralised state. No surprise who comes out on top here. Released a year after Red Devils, Kulesov's film was also a big hit with audiences. The critics took a different view, however, that the appearance of a cowboy on communist screens was an unacceptable deviation from Marxism-leninism. One writer even went as far as to call Kulesov sick, the doctor of Americanitis, taken ill by his own malady. It was left to an expert in morbidity to purge the disease. The rise of Stalin to the paramount leadership of the Soviet Union brought yet more changes. The USSR became a fortress nation, with profound consequences for artistic production. Possibilities for cultural dialogue with the United States were closed off. Instead, filmmakers were expected to follow the dictates of socialist realism, a state-approved mode of art that emphasised party-mindedness, ideological content, class content, and truthfulness. The result of that change in direction can be seen in the glut of historical epics and war films produced during the 1930s and 1940s that faithfully conformed to the party line. That was all well and good for propaganda purposes, but socialist realism also stalled the development of the Red Western and led to a general decline in the quality of Soviet cinema. On some level, Stalin was aware of that. His choice of viewing of an evening? The Johns Wayne and Ford. The Western became a sort of illicit treat for party elites. It would be many years before the Red Western returned to the forefront of communist popular culture. It wasn't until after Stalin's rule, when he'd pushed the frontier of communism across Eastern Europe, that the Red Western had a revival. This took place not in the Soviet Union, but in East Germany, the communist half of the partitioned German nation. That partitioning presented a problem for the hardline governing party of East Germany, the SED. How do you create good communists when the capitalist society next door seems so quotidian, so mundane, so unthreatening? That task fell to DEFA, the state film studio. Their objective was to remove all traces of fascist and militaristic ideology from the minds of all citizens. In that, to a certain extent, they were successful. But even model ideologues like Kurt Maitzig chafed under political control. Maitzig had directed one of DEFA's biggest successes, 1960's Silent Star. In 1965, he charted a very different course into the black hole of East German society. His legal drama, The Rabbit Is Me, was not a favourite of First Secretary Walter Ulbricht. Ulbricht went hunting rabbit films. 11 other works critical of the SED were pulled from cinemas. In the midst of an economic downturn, the party needed a scapegoat. And I suppose a rabbit can pass for a goat if you squint hard enough. Social commentary was a no-go for DEFA. They would have to find another way to remove those brown traces. Maitzig was persona non grata at the studio, but in another way, he was very grata indeed. Silent Star had proven that the studio could do popular cinema, if not with the brio of Hollywood, then at least at the upper end of Poverty Row. They would apply the lessons learned to a favourite genre of German audiences, the Western. Ever since Karl May, the Yankee from Saxony, created the character of Old Shatterhand, generations of German children dreamed of joining their hero on the Desperado Trail. Among them was Adolf Hitler, who cribbed military strategy from Shatterhand. Cultural appropriation took on a slightly more benign character after the war, when ersatz tribes sprung up across Germany. The whiff of Nazism, however, was used by the SED to justify a ban on May's books. Shatterhand finally met his match in the Stasi, or so they thought. His East German fans found a loophole. Perfectly legally, they travelled to neighbouring Czechoslovakia, where the West German film adaptation Treasure of the Silver Lake was being screened. The Czech communists were more liberal than their East German counterparts, giving the lie to the notion that the Eastern Bloc was a monolith of repression. Repression peaked and troughed, like the Elbe Valley. DEFA read the smoke signals. Their prestige project of 1966 would be a Western. But what kind of Western? They couldn't adapt May, nor film outside the Eastern Bloc, and the indigenous American population of East Germany was at best a statistical anomaly. The studio was at a unique disadvantage. From their besieged position, it was not a great leap of the imagination to frame the project around the Lakota tribe, who had earned the special enmity of the United States Army after the Battle of the Greasy Grass. The film, titled The Sons of Great Bear, adapted an ideologically correct tale of one tribesman, Toke Itu, struggling to protect his people from the agents of American empire. To realise the screenplay, DEFA's war band passed into Yugoslavia, then an outlier in the Eastern Bloc. The leader of Yugoslavia, Marshal Tito, was one of the few men who defied Stalin and lived. His decentralised brand of communism was backed by the Western powers, who regarded Tito as their communist. Such a collaboration made the big chiefs at DEFA uneasy. It was hard to argue with vistas like this, however, or indeed this. Yugoslavia's great contribution to the Red Western was Gojko Mitic, an alumni of the physical education programme at Belgrade University. Mitic got his start as a stuntman and never really gave that up. The success of the Sons of Great Bear rested largely on his fake tanned shoulders. He's an ample target for bandits, cavalrymen, even rogue members of his own tribe, but he triumphs against the odds, against even history, thanks to his years of practice on the parallel bars and the vault horse. East German audiences had never seen anyone like him before, but they would be seeing almost all of him for the next decade, as their Indianer film became an annual ritual. The Sons of Great Bear put DEFA back on track. More than that, it was a uniquely red Western, reinterpreting the struggle of the indigenous Americans as an early front in the Cold War. In cinema, as in everything else, the East Germans were zealous anti-capitalists, even if the film-going public was only watching for Mitic. Back east, the Soviet Union went through the Khrushchev thaw and the Brezhnev freeze. It was under Khrushchev that the cowboy returned to Soviet screens, and I don't mean the cowboy in disguise of Red Devils or the postmodern cowboy of Kulazov. No, I mean the real deal, that avatar of all American values, Yul Brynner. Brynner, born in Vladivostok, became Hollywood's go-to portrayer of the other.
I am king as I was born to be.
In 1960, he was cast as the lead in The Magnificent Seven.
Nowadays, men are cheaper than guns.
Will you go? It will be a blessing if you came to help us.
Sorry, I'm not in the blessing business.
With an accent like that, naturally, he was playing a Cajun. The Magnificent Seven was a flop in the United States, but it proved more durable in Europe, and it became a phenomenon in the Soviet Union. To what extent that was owed to Brynner, the hometown boy, is debatable, but the box office figures were unambiguous. It sold 67 million tickets in all, more than double the next most successful film of 1961. Apparatchiks at Mosfilm, the largest Soviet film studio, took notice. Khrushchev shared Stalin's love of westerns, but screening The Magnificent Seven in the USSR had more to do with a relaxation in cultural policy than any special pleading on Khrushchev's behalf. As a further example of the relaxation in cultural policy, it was during this time that the Moscow International Film Festival was established as a biannual event. In 1963, Khrushchev attended a gala screening of Fellini's 8½, and fell asleep halfway through it. Philistine that he was, Khrushchev was retired in 1964 for the crime of being too real. In its place, Leonid Brezhnev instituted greater repression, targeting writers and filmmakers. But in that long winter, the cultural milestones of the Khrushchev era were not quite snowed over. In 1967, Mosfilm released The Elusive Avengers to mark the 50th anniversary of the Russian Revolution. Its magnificent four virginal teens fought an army of slovenly anarchists during the Russian Civil War. Director Edmund Kiyosaian portrayed the conflict as an adventure story for the Komsomol set. Unsurprisingly, it was a hit. Not Magnificent Seven-sized, but enough to earn it a couple of sequels. More interesting were the red westerns of the 70s. These were made in the wake of a special screening in 1969 at the Moscow Film Festival of two Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns. The spaghetti western was the real shift in the genre. It replaced the stout morality of the Hollywood western with the existentialism of mid-century Europe. More to the point, it was violent, sexed up, and overflowed with dollars and gold. No one fell asleep during that double bill. At first glance, the three canonical red westerns of the 70s conformed to the Civil War nostalgia of The Elusive Avengers. But they undercut that nostalgia by borrowing motifs from the spaghetti western. White Son of the Desert is one of the most beloved Soviet films, in which a stoic Red Army captain holds off a Muslim militia with an unlikely band of characters for support. It recalls classic Hollywood westerns. You can imagine Gary Cooper in the leading role. But director Vladimir Motil was also a Leone-style revisionist. This is not a victory for Soviet rationality over religious superstition, but a messy struggle in the Republic of Nowhere Stan. The stakes are low. Sukhov isn't interested in glory. He just wants to get home to his wife. The hero of the Seventh Bullet, Captain Maximov, is also an itinerant military man. The difference between these films is geographic. Director Ali Kamrev is Uzbek, and he filmed far enough away from Moscow to challenge the primacy of Marxism-leninism. Maximov is lacking not a wife, but his comrades, who have fallen under the sway of a Muslim warlord. Allegiances waver, as in the films of Leone. And this is a Leonean landscape. You can practically feel the grit in your mouth. On such rugged terrain, the conflict between ideology and religion takes on a more urgent meaning. The director who borrowed most from Leone was perhaps the closest to him in cultural terms. In At Home Among Strangers, Nikita Mikhalkov, the heir to an aristocratic Russian family, also portrayed the bandit Brilov, whose larceny was once dignified by noble heritage. Of course, for our heroes, a jaded band of Red Army comrades, a white Russian like Brilov will always be sus. But the tension of the film lies in the implication that one of their own number has also turned traitor. The plot of At Home Among Strangers is classic Leone, but you also get the sense that Mikhalkov misremembered Leone's films. He takes the stylisation of it much further, landing at something closer to the avant-garde. The camera swirls, it swoops, it sweeps right into the heart of these austere dwellings. At Home Among Strangers would be an unusual film in Western Europe, never mind Brezhnev's Russia. The 60s and 70s was truly the golden age of the Red Western. East German and Soviet films were popular throughout the bloc, and to a limited extent in the capitalist nations of Europe and America. Their success spurred producers and filmmakers elsewhere in the bloc to create their own versions, with notable examples coming from Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania. The Red Westerns made outside East Germany and the Soviet Union break from the formula in unusual ways. 1964's Lemonade Joe, made in Czechoslovakia, is the perfect example of this. Director Aldrich Lipsky knew the Western inside and out, and then turned it inside and out. He delivered a barrage of sight gags that mock the conventions of the Hollywood Western, the choreographed saloon fights, the flat-pack scenery. There's a manic energy to it. This being a Czech film of the mid-60s, however, it is a dermatillomania, Lipski compulsively picking away at the hide of polite society. The Western, as he understood it, was a product of, and advertisement for, the American dream. This is why Joe, the hero of the piece, moonlights as a soft drink salesman, and why his greatest exploit is the teetotalizing of a frontier town. But Lipski also used the conventions of the genre to satirise communist society, and was so successful that years later, when Gorbachev announced an anti-alcohol campaign in the Soviet Union, he was tagged Lemonade Joe. Or what about the goulash westerns of Hungary? These films are stews, the meat coming from the West, the veg all homegrown. The icon of Hungary's westerns, Doko Rosik, looks and sounds like he's still rooted in the earth. Rosik was Eastwood to Georgi Shomjas's Leone in two classics of the 70s, The Wind Whistles Beneath Their Feet and Wrongdoers. Then, in 1983, he played a good doer, relatively speaking. He couldn't look any worse than the Nazis, after all. Brady's Escape was co-produced with the Americans, starred two Americans, John Savage and Kelly Reno, and was inspired by plenty of other Americans, like John Ford, Anthony Mann, Howard Hawks. It made diegetic reference to the genre. Savage's downed pilot is nicknamed Cowboy by the Hungarian peasants who rescue him from the 1st Panzer Company. Thank Kadar for Rosik, I say.
Mától kezdve, te lovagolod.
Köszönöm.
And then we have Romania. As Hungary liberalised, its neighbour under the dictator Ceausescu pursued stricter autarky in all things, including cinema. This is illustrated in the Transylvanians trilogy of films, produced between 1978 and 1981. In these films, the oafish protagonists travel from the Carpathians to Utah, where they understand little and experience much. The conceit here is unusual. Few red westerns depicted the Eastern European diaspora of the 19th century.
What country? Romania.
Da, drăguță, România! Satul Poplaca!
And none were as nationalistic. The defining image comes from the first film, The Prophet, the Gold and the Transylvanians, where some corner of a western prairie is forever Romanian. More dubiously, it's the only example of the genre to feature that rarest of all dialects, Romanian American.
One moment, Mr. Waltrop. Yeah. I happen to be here. I saw that fellow lashing out at Johnny without any apparent reason.
Colonel Anderson, I'm really surprised. Do you question the evidence given by these honorable citizens?
I only said that it was not Johnny who was looking for trouble.
Well, I have to warn you that everything you may say henceforth may be used against you. Did you...
Oh dear, but that's what happens when you get caught up in the whole self-sufficiency thing. It made no odds to Ceausescu though, who much preferred the Dirty Harry films.
Anderson.
After the last film in the Transylvanians trilogy was released in 1981, the wheels began to fall off the Warsaw Pact wagon train. By the end of the decade, citizens of the Eastern Bloc were outpacing reformists in their demands for greater democracy. 1992 marked the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of history, or at least 75 years worth of it. In the new Wild East, there was no room for the cowboy. By 1996, film production fell to an all-time low. Just 28 films, and none of them westerns. Russia became the world centre for video piracy, which took a toll on its film industry. Bastards! Over in reunified Germany, DEFA was sold to a French conglomerate, who promptly liquidated it. The back catalogue, including all the Indiana films, was tied up in rights issues, preventing their release on home video. For many East Germans, the high of reunification was followed by a nasty hangover. They were left wondering, did the last 40 years really happen? However, the total nullification of East Germany had an unexpected side effect. The comedy Goodbye Lenin well expressed that. East German consumer goods, by virtue of their scarcity and their previous value as propaganda objects, developed a mystique that only intensified in the years after reunification. The same was true of the Red Western. There was no annual treat to replace it. Without it, no means to articulate a sense of national, now regional, identity. Its absence engendered a powerful longing. So powerful it was that the forces of capitalism saw fit to exploit it. Gojko Mitek rode again, first on DVD and now on a streaming platform, and his adventures have found an audience outside of the East German reservation. Critics have been surprised by the high quality of these films. They are, at least in their technical aspects, every bit the match of middlebrow Hollywood westerns, and certainly more truthful in their storytelling. But the value of these films goes beyond their visuals or narratives. They point towards the contradictions that persisted in the film industries and by extension the polities of the Eastern Bloc. Contrary to the public perception of censorious regimes, filmmakers under communism were engaged in a dialogue with their American counterparts. That began with the use of familiar genre conventions, such as the figure of the cowboy, and later extended to international co-productions. At the same time, visual pleasure was carefully balanced with a judicious dose of ideology. In some cases, the Red Western was a replacement for the real thing, barred from exhibition by zealous anti-capitalist governments. But this was not universally the case, and as the winds of change whipped up, so too did those changes filter down to the Red Western. These films are now totems of communism in the Eastern Bloc, in all its forms.